Well, let me extend a very warm welcome to the first of these Social Contract Research Network seminars for the semester. It's my joy, it's my privilege to welcome you back if you've been before, and to give you a especially warm welcome if this is the first time you've been along to one of these seminars. It's always wonderful to see people joining us from all over the world. So if you're from outside Australia, where these seminars are hosted, you're particularly welcome to join us today. And indeed, it is my particular privilege to be able to introduce the latest in what I think we're going to have to start calling a series of Hobbes seminars now, as part of the Social Contract Research Network. I was looking back today over how many we've had, and up until today, we've had 6 seminars on Hobbes. We had Philip Pettit on Hobbes's distinctive view of the social contract. We had Ioannis Evrigenis on the rhetoric of science and the science of rhetoric in Hobbes' State of Nature. We had Joram Kim on Hobbes, the critic of empire, Hobbes on cannibalism in the New World. We had Stéphanie Mertens on civilization and its others, American imaginaries and state of nature in Hobbes. We had Bolek Kabbalah on Of Contract and Covenant, Thomas Hobbes, Baruch Spinoza and Augustine. And although Sandra Field's title didn't include Hobbes, she touched on Hobbes in Spinoza and the social contract as well. So I'm delighted to be continuing that tradition in this seminar today with our latest speaker, Dr. Amy Chandran. Dr. Chandran completed her PhD at Harvard University in 2023 with the title Mortal God, the Religious Imagination and the Making of Leviathan. She's currently working as Assistant Professor of Humanities in the Hamilton Center for Classical and Civic Education at the University of Florida, where her research encompasses no less than historical and contemporary inquiries into sovereignty, power, obligation, freedom, religion, and the institutional foundations of democracy. On these shores, from where I speak, she's also served as a policy advisor in Australia's Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. So I really can think of no one better to address us on today's theme, creating the Commonwealth, power, projection, and religion in Hobbes's Leviathan. So would you please join me in welcoming our speaker for today, Amy Chandran.
Thank you so much for that very warm introduction, Chris. And it's wonderful to be here, and it's wonderful to be zooming into an Australian audience. I live in Florida, but I was just back there in the summer over Christmas, and it was so nice to be back on Australian shores. So, and I'm also thrilled that you're all such experts in Hobbes. This is a project that I would appreciate and love pushback from. So I'm sure that yeah, I will benefit from this kind of audience with the particular expertise that you bring.
Amy, just to let you know, I have unshared your PowerPoint, so you'll need to share it again.
I'm going to share it again.
That.
Super. I'm cool. Let's do that. Oh, no, this one. Okay. Hopefully that works again. Cool. All right. Okay. Now I've got to figure out how to put this down. Okay. Technologically very, very challenged. Okay, great. So Thomas Hobbes is one of the most famous political philosophers in history, as well as just in this network. And if you know anything about him, it's probably this, namely his depiction of an all-powerful absolute sovereign, the Leviathan. The second thing you might know about him, although I'm realizing how much I'm underestimating this audience's knowledge, is that Hobbes is often credited or blamed, depending on what you think, with at least part of the responsibility for inaugurating a secular trajectory that marks out modern political science. A known enemy of religious clerics and the institutional power of the church, Hobbes stands at the advent of a new era of political thinking. He grounds his vision of the state in a social contract, or the mutual agreement of every individual with every other. And so it's long been suggested that Hobbes gets his political edifice off the ground without any appeal to God, religion, or older ideas of divine right that had been so crucial to political legitimacy in the eras leading up to when Hobbes wrote. Today, I'm going to challenge the idea that Hobbes's own political principles were thoroughly secular, or as thoroughly secular as we often think. This isn't to say that he didn't have a hand in inaugurating a modern political science that eschews appeals to a religion, or that the effectual truth of his theory isn't a thoroughgoing secularism. But today, I'm going to make the case that Hobbes sets out an anthropology which views man as naturally religious. And then I'm going to argue that this natural religiosity is closely tied to Hobbes's account of power's projection and its communication via honor, especially as these operate prior to the establishment of a civil society. And then I'm going to suggest that tracing out the possibilities of natural religiosity clarify and illuminate Hobbes's scientific proposal for the construction of a common power. Before we get to that puzzle, let me provide a few notes by way of introduction for anyone here that's less acquainted with Thomas Hobbes. So Thomas Hobbes was an Englishman who lived in the 17th century, and his most famous work, Leviathan, was published in 1651. It's a work that's in 4 parts. The first 2 parts, of Man and of Commonwealth, include all the parts of Hobbes's politics that you probably know and love: his anthropology, his account of the state of nature, his vision of the social contract, rights of sovereignty, blockbuster stuff. The second half of the book, just as lengthy as the first, though not as well known, is comprised of 2 parts, of a Christian Commonwealth and of the Kingdom of Darkness. And these 2 books are dedicated to a very particular understanding of sacred history and theology, and they've occasioned a good part of the most interesting research conducted on Hobbes in the last half century or so. In particular, the question of the relevance of these latter parts to Hobbes's broader political project remains one of substantial interest and substantial contention. That question has received many formulations, and among them, we have Leo Strauss's early writings on Hobbes's critique of religion, in which he suggested that scholars had underestimated the centrality of this critique of religion as a presupposition to Hobbes's political project, rather than an independent addendum to flowing from his view of natural science. Now, that contention, though it was made by numerous others as well, has been taken in different directions in the latter part of the 20th century. So thinkers like Howard Warrender and Aloysius Martinic conceded the importance of the religious sections of Leviathan, but argued against Strauss that this for a reading that stressed the broad conformity of Hobbes's thought with existing strands of Christianity. On the other hand, more recent contributions have revived Strauss's critical view and highlighted the more polemical aspects entailed in Hobbes's attack on the Kingdom of Darkness and its centrality to the work. So thinkers like Edwin Curley or Devon Stauffer, for example, who do see Hobbes as more of a sort of atheistic, secular booster. Okay, fortunately, the old thought that we might just simply give students books 1 and 2 of Leviathan and ignore the rest seems to be a practice of the past, but contentions remain over how we should understand the significance of these later religious parts and what they mean for Hobbes's seminal contributions to modern political science. And that's where the contribution that I'm hoping to make lies. So just to put this in the context of my broader research agenda, because I'm giving you a very small snapshot of a much bigger project today, and you're probably going to see lots of loose ends, and you're right to. But these difficulties are central and motivating questions of a broader book project that was a dissertation that's currently being, all the good things that happen to a dissertation to make it into a book, transformed. So it's in 3 parts, and it begins with an account of the transformation of Aristotle's immaterial intellect into a material imagination, positing that natural religiosity is a kind of culminating capacity or faculty of Hobbes's anthropology. And then I make the argument in the first part that I'm going to present today. So we're in part 1B today. In the second part of that project, I offer an ambitious reevaluation of the 2 halves of Leviathan and how they might be understood as a single whole, arguing for the narration of Abraham and Moses as a kind of exemplar in history, or a demonstration of the principles outlined in parts 1 and 2. And then in part 3, I sort of contend or show how this might help us to appreciate Hobbes's contributions to the emergence of the Enlightenment and debates over progress through history. And I'm happy to talk about that more, although, yes, when it comes to question and answer, if people are interested. Okay, today, however, I'm going to discuss the difficulty of escaping nature. So I'm going to make the case that Hobbes offers us a proposal for constructing a common power that's both more concrete and more religious or religiously inflected than has hitherto been supposed. I'm going to do this in 4 steps. So first of all, I'm going to give a brief overview of the difficulty and the various glosses it's received from scholars. Then I'm going to turn to the meta-ethical or moral foundations of Hobbes's thought, and especially his account of power. And I'm glad to see Sandra Field is here in the audience, an expert in this, who I've drawn a lot from. Third, I'm going to suggest that the clearest discussion of how power is projected is made evident through Hobbes's depiction of man as naturally religious. And fourth and finally, I'm going to make the case that what Hobbes intends to offer in Leviathan is quite a concrete appraisal of how common power might come to be constructed and how this firmly brings together power and rationality at the base of the foundation of the Commonwealth. Okay. So Hobbes famously establishes a picture of life outside the state as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And indeed, his own time was marked by numerous civil wars, and he was very familiar with the problems of civil conflict. A key target, nevertheless, of Hobbes's new political science was an old Aristotelianism that viewed man as a political animal who was naturally drawn into concordia or societas, or an association unified around a vision of the common good. Hobbes's state of nature is a depiction of a multitude of diverse individual wills. The lack of any common judge or any common power sets individuals on an inevitable course towards war. Thus, Hobbes explains, man's natural estate is a war of all against all. The other key variable in the state of nature is a natural equality. Now, this doesn't mean that everybody is the same. There are lots of differences, but it does mean that no one is so powerful that they need not fear death. Indeed, if there were someone so powerful, Hobbes explains, you simply wouldn't be in the state of nature anymore. You would find yourself subject to that person. This state of mistrust and conflict means that any covenant made in the state of nature is precarious, unenforceable, and so inadvisable to enter into, especially if you are a first performer. And yet, Hobbes states that the solution to this problem, this establishment of a sovereign capable of providing security in all further covenants, is brought into being through a mutual covenant of all. This mutual covenant entails the creation of a single will, so that each individual's will is compounded and the result is a common power able to keep all in awe. Now, perhaps you see the difficulty. Hobbes' solution seems to be a condition required for the very possibility of a mutual covenant coming into being in the first place. And indeed, Hobbes is usually understood to suggest that the mutual covenant produces the Commonwealth, that this Commonwealth produces a common power, which in turn is able to instill the necessary fear to force men to keep their covenants, and that this yields the stability for the Commonwealth that is required. The question that Hobbes seems to neglect is the question of how you get any mutual covenant of all to begin with. Now, this omission has made Hobbes the subject of some rather sharp critiques over the years. So just to give a brief smattering of the rather damning diagnoses, we can see that Russell Hardin in 1993 explains that in his theory of political order, Hobbes is bothered by a grievous explanatory problem, how to get out of the state of nature into a political society. His solution, contracting out, cannot work. Likewise, in his early work, A Short History of Ethics, Alistair MacIntyre notes, Hobbes makes 2 incompatible demands of the original contract. He wishes to be the foundation of all shared and common standards and rules, but he also wishes it to be a contract, and for it to be a contract, there must already exist shared and common standards of the kind which he specifies cannot exist prior to the contract. Another example, reflecting on this nearly 120 years ago, Sir Leslie Stephen put it this way. It seems rather difficult, perhaps, to see how you can ever get out of the state of nature, or why the agreement of each man to take the sovereign will for his own is more likely to be observed than any other agreement. Hobbes, however, assumes that this is possible. And finally, and most recently, Daniel Allen suggests, Hobbes describes a state of nature so deadly, so poisoned, that all inhabitants should expect a quick death. Yet he expects unanimity to arise nonetheless, and state institutions to be erected on the basis of that consensus. Most scholars doubt that adherence to his laws of nature would generate the unanimity Hobbes seeks, and they are right. So, not a great deal of confidence in what Hobbes has given us in terms of getting a social contract out of it from a number of eminent readers. In response to this problem, modern scholars have proposed different ways to think about what Hobbes was doing when he gave us a picture of the state of nature and the mutual covenant. So I'm glad to hear that you've had Dr. Avrigenus, because he was the example that I went to. So some people, like Dr. Avrigenus, have foregrounded the role of rhetoric in Hobbes's thought. The state of nature can be understood as an image or a rhetorical device designed to scare Hobbes's readers into submission. Others have suggested that what Hobbes is doing is changing the payoff matrix, right? So he's providing a depiction of how a sovereign might change this and can be thought of as an early proponent of game theory in this respect. But perhaps the most prominent response has been to turn attention to the rational set of principles that Hobbes calls the laws of nature. So thinkers like Sharon Lloyd have suggested that these might be taken to operate as natural duties of a kind, so that Hobbes can be thought of as a sort of proto-Rawlsian, offering us a picture of how the very existence of rational laws might enable a kind of consensus. Though, as Daniel Allen's assessment suggests, there's reasons to doubt this. Now, among the reasons for doubt is the fact that Hobbes himself was quite clear, and this is a quote, that the laws of nature are merely dictates of reason, and although men used to call them by the names of laws, this was improperly, because they are only conclusions or theorems that concern what conduces to one's conservation and defense. Whereas law is properly the word of him that by right has command over others. But Hobbes also adds a famous addendum to this passage at the end of chapter 15, where he explains that if we consider the same theorems as delivered in the word of God that by right commandeth all things, then they are properly called laws. So on the one hand, the first part of the quote suggests that Hobbes's laws of nature are simply descriptions of behaviors that conduce to peace, akin to the law of physics. And on the other hand, Hobbes suggests that they can become laws, binding and obligatory in some way, once they're understood to emanate from God's word. Now, as I mentioned earlier, one line of interpretation in the late 20th century took the second phrase to be evidence of a certain theistic vision in Hobbes's account. Howard Warrender suggested that this exposed a lurking deontic standard manifesting as divine command theory. Most scholars, in response, have resisted this reading and doubled down on Hobbes's claims about naturalism or the need to find the beginnings of an ethical standard in the contract itself. So this passage has served as a site of debate over the moral basis of Hobbes's view. And it was an entry point for trying to discover whether Hobbes's claim that all is matter in motion might not be as pure a vision of naturalism as he made it out to be. To inquire into that underlying feature of Hobbes's thought in this respect, I'm going to briefly overview what I take to be one of the most compelling excavations of Hobbes's normative framework in this regard, and that is the idea of projectivism, outlined by thinkers like Stephen Darwell and Richard Tuck. So Hobbes wrote in a moment where there was significant philosophical turmoil regarding what we might know about the natural world. Various inventions like Galileo's telescope, the discovery of far-off lands, the wars of religion, all caused significant upheaval and promoted a revival of the ancient challenge of skepticism. That challenge amounted to questioning what kind of access it is that we have to reality. So can our perceptions of what we take to be natural in the world really tell us anything about nature? Now, Hobbes, moved and challenged as he was by the revolutionary interventions of Montaigne, Galileo, Descartes, and others, accepted the skeptical premise. Aristotle's realism, or the idea of a verisimilitude or a correspondence between our perceptions of the world and the actual properties that compose that reality, was firmly rejected by Hobbes. The Aristotelian notion that we have access to the essences or forms of a thing, for example, and that this can tell us something about the moral properties or ends of those things, simply could not stand up to the rigor of materialism and the new sciences that Hobbes was a proponent of. Okay, so how then, according to Hobbes, should we understand the fact that human beings constantly engage with reality as though it were intelligible and meaningful? Okay, so take this blue pen, right? Now, some matter in motion has caused a series of movements that produce the image of a blue pen in your brain. And when you imagine the pen's blueness, you suppose that the color really is in that object. And if somebody comes up to you and says, that pen is red, right, you'll likely be willing to get into an argument with them about the redness or the blueness of the pen. You'll call them colorblind, you'll call them silly, right? Because you think that your perception of the pen tracks with the reality of that object. But, Hobbes says, the color is actually in you, and you project it onto that pen or the source of motion that caused your perception. Now, in a similar but less predictable manner, we also project ethical qualities onto the world around us. So take, for example, the example of Mother Teresa or education. We think that these things are really good in some respect. And when we say that they're good, we don't usually think we're stating some wholly subjective opinion about our own preferences or desires. Likewise, we think that pollution and Voldemort are really bad. We project properties like good and evil onto people and objects and activities and ideas so that we think of the world as coming to us already laden with a certain meaning and order. But this isn't the case, Hobbes explains. This meaning and order are of our own making, even if we don't recognize that we're engaged in doing as much. So properties like color, good and evil, are projections that are imputed by the mind. Yet we impose these qualities with a kind of genuine conviction that takes these to correspond to the objective nature of reality. And indeed, one of the surest reasons that we end up in the state of nature, as people like Arash Abazadeh have shown, is that we impose this objective order and are willing, we impose this objective order in diverse and manifold ways. There is likely, nevertheless, someone in this Zoom room who'll be willing to stand up and say, actually, Mother Teresa isn't good, and actually, Voldemort isn't so bad. And they won't mean that these are the types of claims that human beings should reasonably disagree over necessarily, or that it's a question of taste. They'll mean something like, I've missed something about Mother Teresa or Voldemort that would make me think otherwise if I saw it. Now, a difficulty that has been widely recognized with this account is that it produces or seems to leave us with an error theory of sorts. So once you realize that your ethical view of the world is merely projected by your brain, you have a rather deflationary account of normative reasons for actions. It's very difficult to work with this kind of account of ethical or metaethics. There is, nevertheless, an important exception that Hobbes carves out in this account of projectivism. This is an important difference when it comes to power. So Hobbes explains that reputation of power is power, or the projection of power is power. Power, unlike color or moral properties, consists in a set of relations that human beings are capable of creating and altering. And if power reifies itself in relations between persons, according to Hobbes, these relations aren't the kind of thing that we syllogize about. They are the kinds of things that rather show themselves in the event of battle, so to speak. So projections of power are somehow constitutive of power, and power is reified in relations between people in a manner that is long-standing and very familiar to us from, well, all of human history. Okay, so prior to stating that reputation for power is power, Hobbes explains that there are two kinds or two modes of power. One is natural and original, and this is constituted by faculties of body and mind, brains, beauty, and brawn, and so on. But there's also something known as instrumental power, which is a power that is acquired so as to be a means to more power. And the examples that Hobbes gives are riches, reputation, friends, and the secret workings of God. Hobbes explains then in this respect that power is like fame, increasing as it proceeds. Now, this emphasis on the intersubjective dynamics of power has become a recent focus point of study. And as I said, I'm very honored to have Sandra Field here as one of the people that has done most in this respect. But it tracks very old ideas about the difference between potestas and potentia, or juridical right and physical power. And other thinkers have explained that sovereignty is only really secured where you have this more familiar juridical account of potestas, but this exists alongside a kind of de facto or potentia in the power of the sovereign. Now, adding to this, we can see that the notion of instrumental power is particularly important for understanding how it is that power is created in relationships between individuals. Reputation, for example, exists in the mind of a third party who observes or looks onto someone within a context in which they might be perceived as powerful. But of course, all of this assumes the possibility of communicating opinions of power. And to understand how this occurs requires us to turn to the question of honor in Hobbes's account. So Hobbes tells us that honor is most plainly the manifestation of the value that we set on another person. To value someone at a high rate in comparison to oneself is to honor them, whereas to value them at a low rate is to dishonor them. And in chapter 10 of Leviathan, he offers us a very long and detailed analysis of all the ways in which we might communicate honor. Right? So he gives us lots of examples to pray to obey, to give great gifts, to show signs of love, to believe, to trust, to rely upon, to agree with, to imitate. And importantly, he states that all of these ways of honoring are natural. So they work both within the Commonwealth and outside of the Commonwealth, without a Commonwealth. This gives us a natural language of sorts for the state of nature, a set of signs that are able to be recognized even where the meaning of words or the normative properties that things might have is the source of fierce disagreement. Now, what causes honor in Hobbes's mechanistic account is some inward thought or opinion of power and goodness. 3 passions, he tells us, arise from this internal honor: love in relation to goodness, and hope and fear in relation to power. Now, of course, the possibility of being dishonored in the state of nature is a very familiar one, and scholars have long agreed that the quest for honor or glory seeking is somehow at the heart of Hobbes's account about how and why conflict arises in the state of nature. If we return to that picture of the state of nature, we saw that a key feature is the fact that it is composed of individuals and that there's no one person who is powerful enough to command authority naturally. But if we look at what Hobbes says about power and honor in the state of nature, we can see a few more things about the dynamics of this problem. So, summarizing conditions in chapter 17, Hobbes explains about the state of nature: if there be no power erected, or not great enough for our security, every man will and may lawfully rely on his own strength and art for caution against all other men. And in all places where men have lived by small families, to rob and spoil one another has been a trade. And so far from being reputed against the law of nature, that the greater spoils they gained, the greater was their honor, and men observed no other laws therein, but the laws of honor. Sorry, my mouse is playing up. Okay, so in addition to Leviathan's attention to the intersubjective dynamics of power, we can see a few things here. So first, Hobbes suggests that the state of nature is one in which there may be no power erected, or it may be erected in a manner that is insufficient for our security. So he seems to suggest that there's a kind of dynamism in the state of nature, that he's thinking quite concretely about the operation of power and its sufficiency or not for conditions of covenanting. Second, he suggests that the laws of nature are effectively impotent in this state. At other places in Leviathan, in fact, in chapter 17, he suggests that human passions work against the laws of nature in the state of nature. And third, we can see that what is effective in this state are the laws of honor. And the reason for this, as we've just seen, is that honor takes effect precisely because the signs of honor are natural and indeed create or constitute relations of power, even in the natural estate. So power is something that speaks for itself, right? Verifying itself in a contest and in the event of battle. Now we know the laws of honor apply, and we know this most clearly because of the negative case of dishonoring. We see that dishonoring another, if it can be done with impunity, is one of the few options that people have to potentially boost or raise their own value and so their own security in this fearful state. However, you'll recall that a prevailing condition of the natural estate is the perception of natural equality. And given the prevalence of this belief in one's equality with others, particularly in matters of prudence, Hobbes specifies, it's difficult to imagine whence or how acts of honor, as opposed to dishonor, might arise. To honor someone or to something is to communicate an opinion of your relative inferiority, and as such, it is hard to suppose that equals will be willingly ready to honor their peers, at least if they are prudently seeking their own self-preservation. So to trace Hobbes' solution to this problem requires turning to perhaps what is a more novel piece of this thesis, namely that we might look to the anthropology of natural religiosity for a solution. Okay, so we're up to part 3, we're halfway through. In Hobbes' exposition of man's religiosity, we get an account of how it is that acts of honor might be naturally elicited, even despite the conditions of equality that characterize the natural estate. So how does this happen? In chapter 12 of Leviathan, natural religiosity appears as a culminating feature, if you like. It's the final chapter before you get to the state of nature. It's the culminating feature of the fearful and anxious creature that is Hobbesian man, described across part 1 of that work. So Hobbes explains that perpetual fear always accompanying mankind in the ignorance of causes must have some object. And where there is nothing to be seen or to accuse of one's good and evil fortunes, but some agent invisible or some power invisible, that is precisely what man does. When faced with the limits of our knowledge, we impute or project power invisible as the natural response to a fear that we experience in the face of our own uncertainty about future fortune. Hobbes here also introduces a distinction. So he says that while it's true that the gods of the Gentiles were created as projections in response to human fear, this can be delineated from acknowledging one God, eternal, infinite, and omnipotent, that is the biblical God, who may more easily be derived, he tells us, from the desire that we have to know the causes of natural bodies. The omnipotent first cause that we call God arises directly from the propensity for an inquisitive pursuit of natural knowledge. It even arises as a necessary supposition to the act of doing something that looks like science, if you like. That is a seeking of causes. Okay, so here is Prometheus, famed for defying the gods and bringing fire to humanity, that fire being representative of a kind of science or technology. And Prometheus, as you likely know, was punished for his foresight and overprovidence. And Prometheus is therefore Hobbes' exemplar to explain the daily torment that our foresight keeps us in, the perpetual solicitude in which we are placed. Hobbes seems to suggest that man's religious sense is closely bound up with his curiosity and his capacity for science. This account of religiosity is further clarified by the enumeration of 4 seeds of religion. Now, the first 2 seeds that he explains we just saw, namely a widespread belief in ghosts or spirits, and second, an ignorance of secondary causes. But perhaps more important for our topic today is the third and fourth. Now, the third seed of religion is that we are prone to naturally honor those things that we fear, and we honor them by exhibiting signs that are the same as those we would use to reverence men. The fourth is that this ignorance makes us prone to look for prognostics of things to come, or to trust others that we take to be wiser than ourselves. And in iterating this seed of religion, Hobbes gives us an account of all the founders of previous commonwealths, who are 2 sorts of men, again reflecting Hobbes' division between the biblical and pagan prophets, who nevertheless both managed to temper and cultivate this trust with the purpose to make men that relied on them the more apt to obedience, laws, peace, charity, and civil society. So, Hobbes tells us that religion is found only in human beings, making them different from animals. And Hobbes is explicit that it operates in the state of nature. We might even suppose that the conditions of the state of nature prime man for a religious experience, or prime him for a sort of experience of this natural faculty of religion. As the irrational outworking of fear, this religiosity is exemplified in paganism. And as the outworkings of a scientific search for causes, it manifests in projections of the biblical God. Either way, all political founders have utilized man's innate tendency to project power invisible to garner political authority. Now, if the role of fear in Hobbes's account is well known and especially effective in producing projections of power invisible, we can recall that the other main passion that power provokes is hope. And in a passage that has been little treated in the scholarship, Hobbes iterates a role for hope in explaining how covenants and the transfer of natural right occur. So he explains that when the transfer of right is not mutual, that is, when it's unilateral or one-directional, one of the parties will be transferring this right in a hope of gaining friendship, service, reputation for charity or magnanimity, or in hope of reward of heaven. When this is done, what you have is a gift, a free gift, or a grace. And Hobbes is clear that the free gift simply means that the giver is under no obligation, as nobody is in the state of nature. So if fear commonly manifests in a pagan impulse to project power irrationally, the Christian conception of grace is curiously employed in a naturalized explanation of how a voluntary transfer of right might emanate from the passion of hope. A hope, we might suppose, that reflects an opinion of power capable of instilling confidence. And the giving of such a gift would, of course, comprise a sign of honor. But further to this, when we turn to Hobbes's laws of nature, we see that this grace is able to serve as a beginning for benevolence, trust, and so for mutual help in the state of nature. So Hobbes explains that just as justice depends upon an antecedent covenant to come into being, so gratitude depends upon an antecedent grace or free gift. Now, there are interesting theological debates in the background here that help us, or can help further understand what Hobbes is doing in subverting accounts of grace that were being offered in the Christian context for explaining how grace secures man's salvation, political salvation, right? And I can't delve into these right now for reasons of time, but what you see Hobbes explaining is that where you have an antecedent grace, the giver should not be made to repent of their gift. Otherwise, there'll be no beginnings of trust, no beginnings that will deliver individuals from the condition of war. So he seems to set up a sort of parallel role in some respects. Now, you might be wondering, what might this idea of a pre-civil moment of grace look like? How might it be the case that someone be persuaded to freely gift their will to a potential sovereign? As I mentioned, I think one of the most clarifying ways of thinking through this is to turn to Hobbes's account of Moses and the prophetic role that he played in the first founding of a kingdom by institution. So I'm not going to go into much detail here, but I assure you that the book manuscript does. I also have an article that appeared June last year in History of European Ideas that goes into this section of the argument in greater detail. But in Hobbes's account of Moses, he explains that Moses does not inherit Abraham's sovereign right, and therefore the Israelites are not under any obligation to Moses. They obey him freely precisely insofar as they believe that God speaks to him, that he is a mouthpiece for God. And therefore, Hobbes tells us, prior to his election as sovereign, his authority is dependent upon the opinion that people have of his sanctity and on the veracity of his miracles. Hobbes further explains that a core condition of Moses' authority, dependent as it was for serving as a God's representative, is that he didn't claim that he was superior, namely that he was making some claim about his own superiority. Of course, this allows Moses to pay deference to a natural equality that he has as one of God's people, and to exercise a kind of indirect authority in bearing the person of God to the Israelites. So this allows Hobbes to ask, what other grounds might there have been for the Israelites' obligation? And in Moses, we see the classic case of institution. The people vote in Moses as their sovereign representative, and this allows them to remain free in a certain sense, despite their participation in a political kingdom. Hobbes concludes his narrative of sacred history with a general statement that whoever establishes or orders the policy of a commonwealth must hold sovereign power all the while that they do it. And Moses gives us an example of someone who has that power of Moses being expressed both through God's backing via supernatural action and as reflected in the belief and opinions of the people. Okay, so now we can turn back to our problem that we began with, and we're ready to see whether and how these various reflections on honor, power invisible, and the religious imagination leave us better placed to understand Hobbes's proposal for escaping nature. You'll recall that we began with a certain circularity in Hobbes's explanation, one that has sometimes led Hobbes's readers to accuse him of negligence at best. But when we look closely at the problem that Hobbes poses for himself, he says that covenants of mutual trust, where there is a fear of not performance on either part, are invalid. Although the original justice is covenants, yet in justice there actually can be none until the cause of such fear be taken away, which while men are in the natural condition of war, cannot be done. So Hobbes explains that you don't get a commonwealth without a covenant, and you don't get a covenant without removing the fear of non-performance. For a variety of reasons, people often assume that you can't remove the fear of non-performance unless you already have a commonwealth in being. But this isn't quite what Hobbes says. Hobbes explains that it is during the time men live without a common power to keep them all in awe that they are in a condition which is called war. To this war of every man against every man, this also is consequent, that nothing can be unjust. Where there is no common power, there is no law. Where no law, no injustice. What's crucial in making the difference in Hobbes's understanding is the existence of a common power. So we might ask, are there resources beyond the mutual covenant for constructing such a power? Now, certainly the authorization entailed by the mutual covenant is required for the Commonwealth to be brought into being and produces the juridical potestas that Hobbes is so famed for. But the possibility of a mutual covenant itself comes about with the removal of fear by non-performance. And this, we learn, comes about when men are relieved of the state of war by the existence of a common power. Now, in the case of Moses, so we've got, yes, you're following this, the arrows. In the case of Moses, right, we have a picture that doesn't perfectly align with the difficulties posed of the state of nature, but it does have some illuminating features. So first, just as in the natural estate, the Israelites were under no obligation prior to instituting Moses. Second, Moses was a mere representative of God and so didn't violate the precepts of natural equality. He claimed an inoffensive superiority, if you like, an indirect power. Nevertheless, fear of non-performance was removed by recognition of God's direct intervention and power, God's omnipotence, wielded by Moses as a prophetic command over nature. And the miracles he performed secured the beliefs of the people. As a result, Moses secured a series of acts of honor and belief as the representative not only of God, but also of a people whose wills were brought together in his own. Now, of course, Hobbes adopts the crucial adage that was increasingly popular in the 17th century that miracles have now ceased. So it's no longer the case that God intervenes supernaturally. And so the puzzle of modern politics is how we can rationally represent omnipotence. That is, how we can construct a common power that's going to play the role of divine intervention, if you like. Okay. So how do we get this common power is the question. Now, Hobbes is best known for his warnings against false prophets, but entailed in this acknowledgement that prophetic power is to be feared is a kind of confession or an acknowledgement that it's still a live category. That's to say, he doesn't reject the idea of prophetic power, he urges discernment. And why is this? Well, he says, men had need to be very circumspect in obeying the voice of one pretending to be a prophet. For he that pretends to teach men the way of so great felicity pretends to govern them. You might think that's what Moses was doing without pretending. That is to say, to rule and to reign over them, and consequently ought to be examined and tried by every man before he yield them obedience, unless he have yielded it them already in the institution of a commonwealth, as when the prophet is the civil sovereign, or by the civil sovereign authorized. Indeed, just as in the case of institution, as opposed to acquisition, where the victor conquers people in a natural estate, it seems that this is marked by the prophetic mode of power. That is the ability of someone to elicit the willing assent of individuals on the basis of their credibility in holding out a kind of salvific promise of security and political salvation, a kind of promise that they speak for God, if you like. Now, this artificial imitation of prophecy seems to require or invite the existence of a natural as opposed to supernatural prophet. And if we're wondering who might play the part of the natural prophet, Hobbes tells us that the best natural prophet will be the person with the most foresight, or the best guesser. That is, the most prudent person, perhaps Prometheus, okay? And so it isn't difficult to suppose that the natural prophet is one and the same as the natural scientist, if you like, perhaps Hobbes himself, okay? The best guesser. Crucially, prophetic power concerns the future, and the future is the object over which human fears and hopes are born. Now, I've suggested that while the role of fear as the passion to be relied upon is well understood and well excavated in the literature, there is another passion that power produces, and that is hope. If the best guesser is the person best able to predict the future and so able to be provident, the best natural prophet is also the most likely to become an object of hope or confidence in the natural estate. Now, as we saw, hope has the potential to inspire gift or grace, we might think, and the free gift or transfer of right that leads to a good turn in the state of nature. But it's also worth noting that the list of things that Hobbes recognizes to be causes for hope run in a certain parallel to the things that comprise instrumental power. Riches, reputation, friends, and the secret workings of God are not simply what one hopes for, they constitute instrumental power, which can increase as it proceeds at pace. So there's a kind of imitative, positive cycle that can be born of acts of honor around a figure who seems to be trustworthy and credible. By joining one's will to such a power, gifting one's will, if you like, one constitutes oneself as the object of further objects of honor that might be done to an increasingly formidable common entity, common power. What's needed is for man's religious imagination to be directed and imputed in a rational manner. And what is created in this moment is a common power that represents a kind of potentia, a de facto or an actual power, and omnipotence in the imagination that makes obedience both rational and necessary. So if we return to the passage at the conclusion of chapter 15, we can see that the dictates of reason known as the laws of nature only gain their status as laws if they're considered to be delivered in the word of God. So if we project a divine status or power invisible onto these laws of nature, then we have a relation of command and obedience. If we have a divine lawgiver, a natural prophet of sorts, a best guesser, perhaps Hobbes himself, we can adhere to the rational principles of reason and imbue them with the status that they warrant, that is, as delivered in the word of God, if you like. We thus arrive at the Leviathan, who is created by an act of authorization that makes one's gift or transfer of right conditional on the gift of everyone else, and so produces a scientific truth, if you like, or a certainty in the imagination. That's drawing on Hobbes's definition of what science is. It's conditional truth, and Hobbes makes this sort of pronouncement of authorization one that places this condition of gift on everybody else in the state of nature. So this is the coming into being of a mortal God, under the immortal God to whom we owe our peace and defense. Right or potestas and power or potentia can be joined infallibly and in a manner that readily would seem to make disobedience irrationally absurd. So what can be said about the broad takeaways of this reading for Hobbes's thought? Well, first, it recenters or refocuses us on Hobbes as a theorist of power, as Sandra Field and others have been doing in the recent years of Hobbes studies. So Hobbes is perhaps most famous for the mutual covenant, but by seeing that there is more that might be said about the moment prior to that covenant, about the nature of the authority established, we can think about the primacy of power over rationality in Hobbes's picture, in this picture of the covenant that is born not of the laws of nature, but of the laws of honor. Second, I think that this reading can help us to bridge some of the rather now cauterized divides over how to understand Hobbes's views on religion. So this reading recognizes both the importance and the subversive nature of Hobbes's contributions, but it shows that Hobbes's way of producing secularity is through religion rather than as explicitly against all kinds of religiosity. And finally, I think seeing the importance of prophetic power can help us to make sense of certain aspects in modern politics, perhaps. Things that we find ourselves subject sometimes to claims of indirect rule that appeals to science and technology can be seen as a kind of infallible means to our happiness, so that many institutions that now lay claim to the natural sciences earn a kind of dogmatic trust in their ability to deliver benefits. And Hobbes remains a thinker who helps us to see this and to see the sort of nature of power even today. So Hobbes commands enduring respect for his abiding interest in religion and science, and is a thinker who remains deserving of our attention and illuminative of our political condition. And with that, I will thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions and your pushbacks and your gigantic holes in the argument problems. Thank you so much for having me and for listening.
Well, the treat is most certainly ours. What an amazingly rich paper that was. Just let me organize my videos here. Okay. Wow, so much to think about. I'm sure there are many questions. I can see Sandra already has her hand up, so I will yield to Sandra in a moment. If anyone has a question, could you just either raise your hand or just put one line in the chat so that I can call on people in the order that you thought of your question? That would be really helpful. Thank you. Now I'll hand over to Sandra.
Hi, Amy. Thanks for this paper and thanks for all your nice comments about my own work. I'm just delighted when anybody sees has found anything valuable in it. I have two questions if we've got time for it. One may be a little bit more technical, but so I just thinking about the transition in your paper between the second and the third bit, right? And so in some ways, like, you know, I'm sort of all the stuff you say in parts 3 and 4, like, yes, of course, there's this super interesting sort of sociology, anthropology of the way in which belief and ignorance lead to trust in certain figures. And this whole sort of subterranean texture, which is lost if you just look at the purely juridical thing. And, you know, so I'm all on board with that. It hasn't been my own focus, the religious side of that. But yeah, absolutely. That I'm not disputing that. But the way you lead into that, the puzzle, I was not quite convinced, right? And so the puzzle you left off, as I understood at the end of section 4, was, look, if you're in the state of nature, you're all equal. So why would anybody honor anyone? And that struck me as quite an obtuse thing to say, because there's lots of reasons. If I think that, like, okay, we're equal in some sense, but if that guy, you know, if that guy over there, if I think that if I suck up to them a little bit, they might not hit me on the head, or they might steal the other guy's sheep rather than stealing my sheep first. I mean, there's to me, it's no puzzle. The puzzle didn't work for me leading into this very valuable thing that you discuss. It seemed like there's plenty of explanations of why you might, and I feel like, at least this is the more technical bit, I feel that between the earlier, more strictly juridical works and between Leviathan, it's like, what is this equality? It's kind of like, yeah, there's a kind of an equality, but there's kind of also, you know, if somebody's rich, you're going to think of, like, you know, there are differentials even within some sort of moral equality. And they are the things that this very, you know, sort of almost cynical, thin idea of honor latches onto. It's like, yeah, you don't think they're honorable in some meriting honor, but wow, if that, I mean, I often think of like being like an early teen in high school. I don't know if you were like a young teen in high schools at some point,
I
where
skipped
it's
I
not that
skipped
you actually
adolescence,
think
actually.
anybody else deserves honor, but you really don't want to get on the bad side of the people who, like the cool kids, right? There's that kind of thing. So I just didn't quite grab the puzzle, and that the way that, and sometimes, okay, the difference that makes is it seems that that opens up a parallel possible route. So maybe historically you get this common power that you kind of need to bootstrap yourself into a covenant through religion. But it seems like that's one possible thing. And there's another thing which is doesn't even need to be prophetic in any way. You've said, oh, the secular equivalent might be a prophetic thing about scientific knowledge. It seems to be, well, couldn't it just be the much more boring thing that there's the rich guy in the village and then gradually everybody like becomes client to them because they don't want to get on the wrong side of them? So I didn't see, I didn't grab the puzzle, and I would have framed this religious one as one powerful possibility rather than as a necessary solution to this problem. Just the one other question is maybe a bit more superficial, but I was interested that you grabbed onto science, right? For two reasons. Sorry, I'm on video here, I'm sorry, somebody just walked in. So I'm working at home, right? So with science, the first thing, like from the Hobbes point of view and from the contemporary point of view. So from Hobbes's point of view, like, okay, what's the secular equivalent to prophecy? Oh, it's somebody who can see ahead into the future. Oh, that's the scientist. But Hobbes tells us that science is small power because nobody respects it, right? And people don't realize what it can do. And if you get a choice between somebody who's a scientist selling you something very clever that's going to give you a good idea of the future and somebody who sells you a dumb story that sounds great, you're probably going to go for the dumb story that sounds great unless you've really, really thought about it, right? And that seemed to, like, your link to contemporary relevance. I had a similar thought. Like, seriously? The institutions of science? I mean, I think we read different newspapers, right? I mean, at the moment, it seems like, choice between what the scientists are like crying their hearts out to say what you've got to do in order to have a livable future on this planet, and no, they're all bleeding hearts, we're fine, let's drill a bit more oil. What are people running to? So I kind of, yeah, so I thought the role of science and the way you're framing it didn't quite grab me either for Hobbes or for the contemporary. So that's my
That's good. That's helpful. Thank you. Chris, shall I respond? I shouldn't collect. Yeah, I'll just respond.
No, please go right ahead, Amy.
Okay, great. Okay, so on the first question of the puzzle, so there are a couple of things that I could say back to this, though I may just not convince you, which is fine. So the first thing to say is that I'm trying to deal with the text as it is. So it might be the case that you could say something like, well, if we just sort of abstract certain ideas from Hobbes, then we can come up with these alternative parallel scenarios and religion doesn't loom so large anymore. And so wouldn't it just be easier to sort of say, I mean, the way that I think about this is kind of like a video goes viral, right? Reputation for power. And then suddenly people think they have to watch this, right? There is this sort of natural cycle of virtuous respect or reputation that really makes sense in some ways. And we see it very clearly on social media. It's made a very calculable way of how many friends do you have and all that kind of stuff that makes it very, it makes Hobbes really very understandable, right? Really, really relevant in terms of constructing, orchestrating sort of frameworks of meaning and making that, sort of comprehensible to the modern reader. I do think that if you think about what Hobbes gives you in terms of human anthropology in part 1 of Leviathan, I think, first of all, you might just think that there's a reason that he singles out a few things as unique to the human species. And those things are curiosity and religion. And he thinks those things are very closely related. So he thinks that, he even from as early as chapter 2, in Leviathan, and I do think this is a development between the early Hobbes and the late Leviathan if we use those, your division there. So I do think that this is a distinction that happens during the 1640s, that he develops this understanding of religiosity. And I have historical contextual reasons and debates that are going on in France that I think he's tapping into that make him focus on this as a response to Aristotelian rationalism. That is, religion can serve as in opposition, if you like, to Aristotelian rationalism. And so often we sort of lump scholastics in with Aristotelians, and that means the religious folks are in with Aristotle, and then we've only got that dichotomy. But it's really a triangle, historically, contextually speaking. So I do think that there are historical reasons why we should think about this as one response. But I also just think that Hobbes is very clear that somebody with a lot of money doesn't exist in the state of nature because there's no money. So I think you've got to sort of see what are the resources that you have. The state of nature is a kind of impoverished environment because everything is a kind of chaotic question. And there are no, I mean, if you just take the Aristotelian view of politics, that there are such a thing as natural hierarchies, Hobbes has that in mind, and he wants to get rid of the idea that there's sort of a natural hierarchy or an ability to create hierarchies that look agreeable to everybody. And so what are you left with? Well, you're left with a kind of who actually has power. And I think he thinks because of the nature of human beings, there's a lot of, I'm going to just collect up my buddies and we'll go and kill the big guy in the state of nature. But he thinks that that ultimately is just a cycle of destruction. And so the question is, how do you get hope? And hope, I think, he thinks is something to do more with our religious sensibilities, or something to do more with, I mean, even when he talks about honor, for example, he wants to say there is a kind of goodness that you need to be attracted to. So in terms of the laws of nature, if you just think about chapter 31, where he goes and he says, basically, there's this second half of the laws of nature, which is what is owed to God or divinity. And I do think there's a sense in which that second sort of half is all about this kind of instinctive response that you have when you hope and you fear, and that he connects that all into questions about worship. And he just thinks that there's something very religious about those passions, that they strike about the future and about the unknown in a way that people just go to invisible powers. I mean, invisible powers are this thing that repeatedly comes up as a kind of stopgap for when you don't understand natural science. And I think he thinks there's some sort of spectrum along which you might, the more that the power of science increases, the less that you have a kind of irrational imposition of power invisible, and that is a kind of healthy dynamic, but it's one that requires, to get off the ground, a kind of admission that a lot of this is going to be based in an irrational imputation of power or something like that. To the question of science today, it's a good one and it's a tough one. I do think that Hobbes is kind of on the side of like, wouldn't it be nice if de facto power was with rationalism or something like that? So I do think there's a sense in which the whole polemic against, I have an article on transubstantiation essentially making this point where I sort of want to point out that like he has this sort of obsession with the ways in which power is imputed irrationally in this religious context. And he thinks exactly this, that clerics, what are they really good at, and what are they really, what makes them really bad? They get people to put God's power onto all sorts of things, right? In this case, the pagan gods and also the Catholic priests with him in France both share this kind of ability to impute or make people impute power onto precisely the wrong objects, onto completely powerless objects. And he thinks this is so silly. So I do think that he is very much on the side of irrational materialism is the grounding basis. And the ultimate goal, the theodicy, if you like, of his work is to sort of try and explain how is it that you can arrive at a state of peace insofar as you're imputing power and you're having the people impute power onto people that are actually good wielders of power, people that actually can secure a good future. So Yeah, I think, yeah, perhaps the way that I put that was backwards, but I do think that what Hobbes is suggesting is that it would be nice if institutional science received, or the correct, maybe, I don't know, depends what people think of institutional science, but it would be nice if there was some sort of alignment between rationality and the perception of power.
Oh, I suppose in your
Sorry, Sandra,
presentation.
can I just say very quickly, I am going to hand back to Sandra in a moment for a follow-up. Could I just encourage other people in the meeting to be thinking of questions as well? It would be lovely to open this a little bit wider. So if you do have a question, do pop it in the chat and I'll call upon you. Sorry, Sandra, I interrupted.
Oh no, I mean, I'm always happy to chat. I could sort of chat the whole time, but it just, so that's interesting because I suppose that frames, I suppose I'd understood the final section of your paper as saying, just as sort of as a matter of sociological fact, you've had these prophetic religious prophets, but now the contemporary analog, which we're going to see as a matter of sociological fact, because that's just like the natural tendencies and dynamics, is it's going to be the science guys who are in charge. Whereas it seems actually you're sort of maybe, but you're a little bit more committed. That's what we're gunning for, and we might be able to make work or something, rather than saying that that's sort of
Right. You know what? It's funny. I was writing this PhD during COVID, and it was like such a funny time to talk about this because half the you never know what you're going to get. But yes, I think that this can just cut in both directions today. So there are just different ways in which you can see there are both factions of institutional science that probably have too much authority, and Hobbes would be on the side of trying to say something like, there's an alignment that needs to happen between de facto power and actual effective science or something like that. So he's against quackery or something like that. And yeah, and then the question is, I guess, what science journals you read today or whatever. But yes, absolutely.
Thank you so much. I wonder if I might ask a question of my own, Amy. First of all, I can't wait for the book to come out after this, and I'd love to know if there's any indication of when we might be able to expect that coming out, because we're waiting with bated breath. My question is about the relationship between the state of nature and God. And I found it fascinating that you drew our attention to the idea of grace in Hobbes. Now, I hadn't really noticed that. It hadn't stood out for me before. And my question is in two parts. And the first part, which I think is the least interesting, the less interesting of the two, is how does Hobbes triangulate the relationship between the state of nature and a transcendent lawgiver? You know, that God is supposedly there then in the state of nature and is not neutral with respect to law. God is a lawgiver. And so does that change if we, sorry, think about it this way. If God is there, is the state of nature a different place to if he isn't? And does he need to be there for us to understand Hobbes' state of nature? I guess would be one way of putting that. And the second part of the question is in relation to whether Hobbes is consistent on this or not. So there's that moment in the Latin Leviathan where he wheels in Cain and Abel. And as an illustration of the state of nature. And he said, did not Cain, out of envy, kill his brother Abel? A crime so great, he would not have dared it if there had at that time been a common power which could have punished him. And many people have pointed out, well, hold on, you read Genesis 4, that's exactly what there is. He is punished for what he does. And that's sort of an argument that's been made quite a lot. But I just want to push that further in relation to the grace that you mentioned, because God doesn't only punish Cain, he also protects him. The sign of Cain that's given is a protection so that people don't go and murder Cain. And so there exists in Genesis 4, it would seem, a God who not only punishes but also shows grace and also protects. And can Hobbes conjure with that? Does he factor that in to the way that he understands grace in the state of nature?
Very good question that I'm going to have to think about for longer than I'm going to be able to answer. But okay, great question. So the first one of how does Hobbes triangulate, or how do we deal with the transcendence of God as a divine lawgiver? So this, what you might be asking is just the question of what do you do once God stops intervening supernaturally? And I take it that Hobbes takes this to sort of be the central question of modern politics. Namely, and if you actually look at chapter 32, where he basically says, what are the principles of a Christian Commonwealth, right? The central question is essentially, how do we know who speaks for God anymore? So the central question is like, who's the prophet once God's not speaking through the miracles of Moses, etc. And this was the puzzle in the 17th century. You're almost a century into the Reformation, and you don't have the visible church to point to as the institutional sort of representative, if you like, of God. And this is the sort of Protestant crisis of, well, who do we know? How do we know what's real? How do we know who speaks for God? So if that is a central puzzle, Hobbes's response is essentially, I think, to say something like, God works through natural causes now. So God works through direct intervention, or he did work through a direct intervention in history, and now he's kind of got natural causes as his mode of intervention. And that means that you had this weird mix between transcendence and immanence in Hobbes's scenario. So you get, people like Vogelin talking about the sort of immanence of the eschaton, right? I think there is a sense in which Hobbes gives you that theodicy very clearly. So there are passages in the part 4 of Leviathan where he sort of says, how can we make sense of all the crimes and sufferings, or how can we make sense of this sort of ragged history that we have from the time that the apostles, from the time that actually Constantine converted, right? From the time that the reunification of sovereignty happened, how do we make sense of that? Well, he says, the Protestant Reformation is a great example of essentially the Catholic clerics getting so over their heads in the power that they had that their nets broke, and you saw all the machinations, and suddenly it all became clear that these people are not people to be trusted. And he says you go back to the first sort of inklings of power, the first web or invention of power, which is wisdom, sincerity, love, goodness. So there is a sense in which he wants to say the natural virtues, if you like, or the natural sort of mercy, all these sort of Christian virtues are really important for sovereigns. Matthew Hoy, I think, is that the name of the recent book? He speaks about this. I'm sorry, I'm butchering his. Anyway, he speaks about this in his sort of recent book on the importance of virtue for sovereignty. And I think that's exactly right. So there is a sense in which God operates, he thinks, through secondary causes, and that there is an ultimate omnipotent plan, that you're going to see rationality come together with power, and that will ultimately happen. And so you can just always ask, where are we up to in this natural history, or the history that comes after the sort of age of supernatural, or the age of miracles. And Hobbes will say something like, well, we could start again. So so there's a sense in which you could sort of think his particular moment in English history, when he appeals to independency. I've got an article about to come out basically making this claim, but I think that the appeal to independency is an appeal to say, we're back in the state in which we don't have any kind of sovereign with civil and ecclesiastical power. We're back in a kind of state of nature, and we're going to have to get to that place where we have somebody that we trust with both religious and civil authority. That's necessary. And so we're in this initial independent stage again, where our eyes have been opened to the problems of the moment, and here we find ourselves. So there is a sense in which God remains transcendent because he's not directly intervening in history. And you might just think that comes to an end in Hobbes's ultimate eschatology, which sees Christ as the universal ruler of the world, right? The universal monarch. And when that happens, all bets are off. Laws of nature don't matter, right? Because God's back on the throne in direct charge. But in the interim moment, it's secondary causes all the way down, or it's natural causes all the way down. I don't know if that helps, but yes, you can come back to me. Cain and Abel, that's a great question, and it's never really been put to me like that. That's a funny paradox about, because there's a book about Cain and Abel and this Hobbes's treatment of this. I'm going to forget her name. Anyway. So yes, you're right. So the punishment of Cain and Abel does sort of appear as this subversive passage. I think probably what I have to go back and sort of think about this more. That's just a very helpful question to raise. But the protection thing is interesting because I do think that there is a sense in which that probably does work in some respect, but it's complicated because sacred history is still in the age of direct intervention. Anyway, I'm going to have to think about that one. That's a really good question. In general, I have basically carved off the Latin Leviathan and sort of recognized there are a number of changes that Hobbes makes in the Latin Leviathan. And in part, I think that they strengthen the case for this kind of reading because they exclude passages that you can see kind of come to the fore in this reading, and precisely would have gotten him in trouble for those reasons. So there are certainly is a sense in which the Latin Leviathan has to eventually come into the project. But I will say for the moment, it's sort of been focused on reading the English Leviathan and sort of using that just as a checkpoint. So I haven't gotten into that, but I will. So thank you very much. That's a really helpful question.
That's wonderful. Thank you ever so much, indeed. Really, really helpful answers. A lot for me to think about in relation to that. Now, I do have another question, but I'm very keen for this not to be just me firing questions at the speaker. So I would encourage anyone, if you've got a point of clarification, anything you want to ask, you want to push a little further on, do please raise a hand or put a question in the chat. As I wait for people to do that, I might ask my second question and then yield if anyone pops up. It's a question related to this idea of projectivism, which I hadn't come across until you mentioned it, and you explained it very, very helpfully. And it's a skepticism about that position and how strong it is. Because is it not the case that it's all sort of won and lost in the type of examples you choose? So if we take the blue pen, its blueness could well be a function of our, apparatus of perceiving. But not the fact that it is there, that there is something there, its existence, or the fact that whatever we may choose to do or not do with it, it can actually scribe things. It has a function, and we may choose to ignore the function, but whatever else it can do, it can write. And those things, would it not be harder to suggest that they are projections? And so then we've got the goodness of the pen in an Aristotelian sense, the fact that it writes isn't utterly subjective. It does write. Now, it may be blue or not blue, depending on what we project on. And so wouldn't a position something like Kant's be a pushback against this? So yes, things like space and time are categories of our reason and not objectively out there in the world, but they're a priori categories. Like everybody's got them. And so it's not as easy as saying it's either objectively out there in the world or it's completely up for grabs and just projected and not real at all. There is this potential middle ground for, yes, we're projecting this stuff, but it's still universal, and it's still real. And I just wonder if the people who use this argument of projectivism have explored that sort of potential. Wait a minute, it's not quite so black and white as you're making out. There are other ways of thinking about projection that don't make it completely subjective.
Like Immanuel Kant, indeed.
Like,
Absolutely. So, I mean, I do think, you can, when you start to see this epistemological side, you can trace it through the whole sort of canon of thinkers. And in some ways, it is the sort of question of modern politics. So there are a couple of things I could say. So one is, you're exactly right that whether the pen writes or not, it writes. And that the fact that there is something is important to Hobbes. So actually, there's this funny change in Leviathan, where he wants to say, I'm sorry, I'm like digging, when you write a dissertation and then you put it down for a year, that's I'm just coming back to this project to like pick it up again and turn it into a book. So it's not all super close to hand, but there is this passage in Leviathan where he's talking about dreams, and he is talking about how do you sort of figure out whether you're dreaming or not, right? And in the early Hobbes, he's not sure if you can figure out whether you're dreaming or not. But in Leviathan, he basically says, no, you can figure out whether you're dreaming or not, because there is this rational ordering to the way that things happen. And I think he's thinking through these things very concretely at that level of like what matters in terms of like the rational outlay or outline of reality and the objective facts on the ground here. The colorblind thing, so the color of the pen blue, he actually uses colorblindness as he was famously colorblind. So he himself had this experience of seeing green as red and red as green or whatever. And so that, I think, was an important sort of phenomenological fact about his experience of the world that he took to heart. And so the color thing is an interesting one, where you do see the kind of concrete sense in which he's thinking about the fact that properties are in the mind, and that is the case. I do think that something like functionalism or the goodness of the writing of the pen or something can be argued for without an Aristotelian teleology, and that he is arguing against teleology, and that gets kind of caught up in it, but that's not what he's necessarily checking out. So I don't think he's not suggesting that there's nothing, that there is nothing that is actually good in the world, or that there is nothing that we can kind of know to be good or something like that. I think he thinks that is essentially shown by power or something. The question is, how do we come to agree on those things, and whether formal or final causality can provide that for us? So he's trying to get rid of, if you like, the Aristotelian notion of practical reason that sort of situates man amid his reality as an ordered whole. And he's trying to sort of build from the ground up and say, well, how is this actually coming into being? Like, how do we construct these meaningful examples? And why is there so much disagreement about the kind of invisible properties of things like goodness and badness and rightness and wrongness and truth and etc.? So I do think the less tangible a property is, if you like, the less material a property is, the more Hobbes is going to sort of rely on power as an explanation, or honor as an explanation for how that came into being as agreed upon. But it does create, or it does, you might think, preference, or create this sort of strange fact that history is really important for Hobbes. So history is often thought to be not as important for Hobbes in some ways, but history is the story of how we've constructed our power structures. And history is really important in that respect. And so, there is something to be said for the reading that he, wants to hat tip to Christianity just from that perspective, because he recognizes, well, the structure that I'm working within here is Christian. And that is how we understand what power is today, whether he likes it or not. So I'm not sure if that, so you're right insofar as you might just object to the whole notion of projectivism and say, Hobbes, you're wrong. Or you might be saying Hobbes isn't a projectivist. But I do think that there's pretty good thorough textual evidence to say something like that is how he's thinking about the way that meaning is constructed, and the way that he thinks that the reality sort of comes to us and is received by the human material imagination.
Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you. That
Great
is
question.
that really clarifies that position. This is the last opportunity for anyone who hasn't asked anything yet to ask a question. And in a few moments, I'm going to wrap up. So dive in now, or forever hold your peace, as it were. Unless anyone jumps in, I just want to thank you, Amy. That was an incredibly rich presentation, and you engaged really thoughtfully and deeply with the questions, and gave me certainly a huge amount to think about. I'm going to have to go away and process a lot of this later on. So I wonder if everybody could join me in thanking our speaker for today, Dr. Amy Chandran. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great to be with you all. Great to, and I've put my email address up there if you have further comments or questions. Always happy to engage. Thank you.